Hey guys, this is another video about the European Team Championship, arguably the biggest matchup there is in the chess world. The world champion Magnus Carlsen played against the former world number 2 Levon Aronian, who's been getting back in shape recently, winning the super tournament in St. Louis, the Sinkfield Cup, and therefore starts looking like his old self, back in the top 10 and on the rise. Also the guy who got the wild card for the upcoming candidates tournament. This is not the most recently played game. It was played in number 3 of the European Team Championship when Armenia met Norway, but too big a game to ignore. Let's get right into it. Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces representing Norway on the top board. His first outing actually, he set out the first 2 rounds while Levon Aronian has been representing Armenia on board number 1 for as long as I can think of. Probably not true, but more than 10 years. Aronian with black against Carlsen. He's had a tough time recently with the black piece against Magnus Carlsen, but that goes for pretty much everybody. Carlsen goes for 1 e4, has defeated Aronian with 1 d4 in the recent past as well, but e4 is, at least in my mind, always Carlsen's main move. e5, Aronian, a classical guy, tends to stick to e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, good old Ruy Lopez, and Aronian goes for the Berlin, knight f6. He's abandoned the Marshall camp a little bit and has preferred the Berlin recently, as have most top players, really. The Berlin is very much en vogue, and you see a lot of guys, including Magnus Carlsen, avoiding the Berlin endgame that arises after castles, knight takes e4, d4, knight d6. Even though in this European Team Championship, white has had success here once or twice. Still, Carlsen goes for the move d3, aiming for a more Carlsen-esque position with more pieces on the board, a typical Ruy Lopez structure, and a position he has tons of experience with from both sides of the board. Bishop c5, here white has 3 main moves, bishop takes c6 is one of them, reaching this very fixed structure where black is supposed to be fine, but I'm sure white is not out of bullets here either. c3, the alternative, covering the d4 square and preparing for more typical Spanish play. And then there's the move that Carlsen plays, the very natural move, castles. He's played this before and his opponents have replied d6, most notably Vishy Anand in, was it their World Championship match? I believe so. Vishy Anand played d6 here against Carlsen, but Aronian plays the move that is considered the main argument against castles instead of c3, the move knight to d4. Black exchanges a pair of pieces, and this knight on c6 is always a bit of a problem piece in the Ruy Lopez after c3 doesn't have a lot of squares to go to. So I was very curious to see what Carlsen had in store here, since his opponents hadn't tested him in this line. Knight takes d4 is clear, bishop takes d4, c3 also obvious. Chasing his bishop away from d4, bishop goes back to b6, and knight to a3. All of this has been seen before. White is intending, if he's allowed to grab the bishop pair with knight c4 and knight takes b6. Not gonna happen. Aronian goes c6, creating a square on c7 for the bishop and chases the white bishop away. Bishop a4, of course you wanna keep the c4 square available for the knight. d6, all of this has been seen before. Castles is also a main alternative in this position, which was played between Kayakin and Onishuk, for example, recently in the Baku World Cup. But d6, of course, can't be wrong, reinforcing the e5 pawn, opening the way for the bishop. It's just a developing move, and sometimes you want to wait with castle, or some people want to, so this pin is less awkward. Because if you haven't castled yet, you can meet bishop g5 with h6, bishop h4, and g5, which is a tougher thing to do after you've castled. So Aronian goes d6, as I said, nothing new here. Bishop to b3, the bishop occupies its rightful diagonal in these lines. And now white is getting ready to jump to c4. Of course, you could jump to c4 immediately, but then after bishop c7, this bishop would have to move anyway, because black would threaten b5. So bishop b3, a little more flexible. And Aronian says, okay, if you don't chase my bishop away immediately, I'm going to try to keep it on this long diagonal. I don't want to put it on c7 passively. He plays the move a5. I've seen this move before. I believe Caruana played it. Which was it? I wrote it down. Hang on, let me check. Caruana played this with black against Kayakin in Zurich. And it was a little over my head when I first saw it. I thought h6 to stop bishop g5 or even just short castles would be more natural moves. In this game we see the idea that Aronian had connected to it. After knight to c4, he goes bishop to a7. Caruana had played bishop to c7 instead, but Aronian wants to keep his bishop on the long diagonal, goes bishop a7. I'm not sure if it's a long diagonal, but it's an open diagonal. Let's put it that way. An active diagonal. Whatever. Bishop c7. So we've reached a typical Carlsen position. It's not very theoretical, but the structure is established. I don't think what he's doing is a refutation of the move knight d4. I don't think it can be refuted. But he decides to switch to very concrete play here already. Ah, no, it's not true. First he goes a4. Not that concrete. Fixing the pawn structure on the queen side. Doesn't want to allow black to go b5 or even a4. Let's say you played a3. Black could go a4 and you can't take because of b5. Therefore the bishop would have to go passive. Carlsen doesn't want that and he plays a4, fixing the structure. Aronian castles, which is a move. It's an obvious move, but I'm always feeling a little uneasy about it because it allows this pin that was played in the game, the pin bishop g5. And with this bishop very far away from breaking the pin on a7, it always bothers me a little bit. Aronian goes h6, trying to clarify what intentions this bishop has. And this move involves a pawn sacrifice, so it's not a move you can just blitz out. It had to be considered very carefully, unless it was considered at home, but I do not think that Aronian prepared this. Then again, who knows? Carlsen has a choice here. He can go bishop h4, which would be the move I'd be worried about because of this pin I just mentioned. And my guess is that Aronian wanted to meet it with the extreme g5 anyway, forcing the bishop to go to g3, breaking this pin at the price of weakening his king. These positions are always hard to evaluate. My best guess is, since Aronian allowed this and Carlsen didn't go for it, that black should be fine here. Maybe something like bishop g4, queen d2 and knight h5 to chase down this bishop or put the knight on f4 with a very complicated position. My best guess, as I said, is that it's roughly equal. But Carlsen says, nah, I believe you, bishop h4, g5 is fine. Show me the money, I'll try to grab your pawn. He goes bishop takes f6. And black is more or less forced to sacrifice his pawn with queen takes f6, this pawn, the one I'm talking about, because gf6 is just a terrible move positionally. After queen h5, for example, king g7, knight e3. There's too many holes around the black king, so you can't do this. Aronian gives a pawn with queen takes f6, knight takes a5, and now the question is, does he have enough compensation for it? He does have the two bishops, but if white were allowed to come back with his knight to safety, it's doubtful that black has enough, but Aronian has spotted a very interesting move to complicate the position further. He goes for the move d5. The positional idea is clear. It stops white from going back to c4, and it also blocks this bishop from this diagonal, but there's a lot of tactical points to it. First is after e takes d5, c takes d5, bishop takes d5, which looks obvious. Black has the cute little retreat, queen d8, attacking the knight on a5 and the bishop on d5. Looks like white has a way out with bishop takes b7, but here after bishop takes b7, knight takes b7, queen c7, turns out that this knight is trapped in the enemy camp, doesn't have a retreat from b7. White would have 3 pawns for the piece, but it's not enough in this position because the white pawns aren't far enough. How tough can this sentence be? Aren't advanced far enough to provide fair value as compensation for this bishop. So you can't do this, and therefore Carlsen had to look for another way to keep his knight alive. Because bishop b6 picking it up was already a threat. He had to go passive, played bishop to c2, clearing the b3 square for his knight, maintaining his extra pawn, but now it's a little more feasible that black will have good compensation for his pawn, and Aronian decides to play very directly, open the d file, d takes e, and rook to d8, attacking the queen, which of course he's not gonna be able to take, but also eyeing the d2 square. He wants to follow up with queen g5, and a rook on d2 could be quite unpleasant. Because Carlsen anticipates this, he goes for queen to e1. The first move that comes to mind is queen to e2, but then black would indeed go queen to g5, threatening rook d2, threatening bishop g4, winning a tempo, and sometimes bishop h3. This is very unpleasant for white. Therefore, Carlsen had to go for the more passive move, queen to e1. Once again, Aronian plays a good move to keep the pressure up, ask white questions. He goes queen g5 anyway. Even though rook d2 is not coming with tempo, it's still posing some threats. Bishop h3, now an idea, and rook d2 to attack this bishop, also quite unpleasant. Bishop h3 has to be addressed, so Carlsen plays the only move here. King to the corner, king h1, in order to discourage this move. And Aronian continues naturally with rook to d2. We can see that, yeah, for now black is calling the shots, but if white manages to unravel, get his knight back somehow, he would still be pawn up, so the tension is still extremely high. Carlsen plays a good move once again. He plays the move bishop to d1. Bishop to b3 might look more natural, but then black just grabs the pawn on b2, restores material equality, and with the white pieces a little stranded and the two bishops, black would be better. So white has to go for the more passive bishop to d1. His point is, if now rook takes b2, knight c4, all of a sudden this rook is trapped. Even though it looks like it has tons of square available, really doesn't have a square to go to. So you can't grab that pawn. But Aronian doesn't want to. Instead, he offers up another pawn, goes bishop e6, not only preparing to bring this rook into the game as well, but also cutting off the retreat from the knight for the knight to b3 or to c4. And just looking at the position, it feels like black should have very good compensation. Still, you are a pawn down against a world champion and you have to prove it. Carlsen plays strong move once again, goes b4, defending the knight on a5 and also stopping rook takes b2. And Aronian keeps his foot on the gas, goes rook a d8, saying, you know what, I really just want to develop quickly. I believe in my active pieces. You can take on b7, then we'll see whom the complications favor. Carlsen doesn't have to be asked twice and grabs this pawn, but this move turns out to be rather risky. We see this little computer bar here shrinking by the minute, which indicates that now black has a really good position. Black had full compensation for the pawn anyway, if not more, but it looked like Carlsen had to go passive and move like bishop to e2 and try to survive this, possibly by exchanging this rook with rook d1. Black has a pleasant position here after rook d7, but nothing more than that. Still, knight takes b7, of course the critical test, and let's see what Aronian had in store here. First move that comes to mind is rook d7, but then white has a choice between knight c5, blocking off this bishop, or just returning, attacking the pawn on c6, and nothing direct is in the cards for black. Therefore, Aronian chose to play a more forceful move, leaves this rook en prise, and goes for direct operations. He goes for bishop c4, counter-attacking against the white rook on f1. This had to be calculated very carefully, but let's see what his point is. Bishop c4, knight takes d8, only move. You can't remove this rook because f2 would drop. So you have to do something. You have to grab the rook, knight takes d8, bishop takes f1. This was the idea, of course, taking the white rook, threatening mate on g2, so once again no choice. This bishop has to go. Queen takes f1. And now, of course, Aronian's idea was not to recapture on d8 and stay 2 pawns down. He would have some compensation, but instead he wants to continue pressing, goes rook takes f2. All of the stuff, as mentioned, had to be calculated very carefully, but it looks like Aronian was very much up to the task. Rook takes f2, threatening, of course, rook f1, and if the queen were to go to e1, queen g2 would be checkmate. Therefore, white move is forced to move queen to g1, which already looks quite scary because it is on the diagonal of this bishop. Still, if black were to recapture now, queen takes d8, white could just, he could move this bishop, or he could go queen e1, then potentially put his bishop here, be a pawn up, and if there's nothing direct for black, white would still be alright. Therefore, after queen g1, Aronian once again doesn't waste half a tempo on recapturing a measly piece, goes for the gauntlet with rook to a2, discovered attack on the white queen. And this is pretty awkward to meet. You can't take on a7 because this is checkmate once again. You can't go back to f1 because Black just goes rook takes a1, and queen f7 is only one check after king h7. White is totally lost. So Carlsen does what he has to do, and that is to give up his queen here with rook takes a2. When after bishop takes g1, king takes g1. Black faces a choice. He could finally, now that he's won the queen, recapture on d8. When he would have a queen versus a rook, a bishop, and two pawns, which on paper is enough. Oh no, sorry. One pawn. We're missing that one. One pawn. So on paper it's enough to compensate for a queen, but the black queen is very active, and this position would probably be nice for black. So it's unclear what Carlsen missed when he entered these complications. Maybe he just didn't expect Aronian to sacrifice his rook with this move, bishop to c4, or maybe he just evaluated the other options to be even worse and thought this position that he got was still quite defensible. Defensible, I always get that one wrong. However, Aronian decided against queen takes d8 and went for another move. Pretty impressive how he just ignores his knight on d8 for I don't know how many moves, goes queen c1, says, you know what, I think bishops are stronger than knights. You can keep your knight, but I would really love to capture your bishop. And Carlsen doesn't have a choice but to agree. He goes king f2, knight c6, would just transpose. King f2, queen takes d1, and now knight takes c6. When, once again, white has a knight, a rook, and this time around, if I'm counting correctly, it is two pawns for the queen. Enough material compensation, but the queen is just too active, and the king is also a little open, providing plenty of targets for the queen to check. Aronian just keeps attacking things relentless. Queen b3, hitting the rook. Unpleasant choice, rook d2 or rook e2. Neither move promises full equality. Rook e2, queen takes c3, b5 for example. Black could go queen a3, trying to pick up this pawn. If a5, queen c5 check. So something's about to fall. Or you could even play more ambitiously. Let's say queen c5 check, king somewhere, or rook e3 and f6, counting on the fact that you can keep these pawns at bay and you want to not even part with your e5 pawn. The computer gives a big edge for black in both these cases. Once again, testament to the power of a queen in the open court. Carlsen didn't like this. He went rook d2, trying to activate his rook. Next move is clear. Queen takes c3. Double attack, but this can be parried with rook d6. Well, once again, these pawns do look a little scary, but black is to move. He has the super active queen, and he does not miss a beat. Goes queen b2 check, king e3, queen a3 check, king f2. Now he could take on a4, cashing in, and he does. When white maybe should have tried knight takes e5, but even this position after knight takes e5, queen takes b4, the pride of white, the two passed pawns are gone. Rook d8 check, king h7. White is not in time to take on f7 because this construction is a little too shaky and the knight would drop. Let me see what is the smartest to do. I think you can do it with checks, queen c5 check. And then wherever the king goes, this knight will be picked up with a couple more checks. For example, king f1, queen c4, and it drops. Therefore, if you can't take on f7 and you have to go something like knight f3, queen takes e4, this looks like a technical win. It would take a while, but with the extra pawn on the king's side, combination with a strong queen, I don't think this can be held for white. Where was I? Queen takes a4, knight takes e5. This was actually played, and the line that I was showing, I'm very confused as usual, was not played by Aronian. It's a line I was analyzing, and which I thought also led to a win. But Aronian decides to play even more directly. Once again, doesn't want to capture material, but instead wants to keep his initiative going. So this position was reached, and he went queen c2 check instead of queen b4. Apologies, I get confused. And queen c2 check, also extremely unpleasant to meet. King e3, then you're just dropping these guys, and if the black queen can feast on the kingside pawns, black will win sooner or later. So Carlsen goes king f3, which looks like he has everything defended for now at least. If queen c3 check, then knight d3, and white would have very good chances of survival. But Aronian has foreseen this and comes up with the next blow, the move f5. Turns out you can't take it, because after queen f5 this knight drops, and with this new unit entering the attack, the white pieces are just overstretched. It becomes almost impossible to defend. At the very least you lose the g2 pawn, which is enough. Carlsen plays the only move, rook d3, breaking the connection to the e4 pawn. But now this happens, f takes e4, king e4, queen g2 check. Knight f3 is forced, you don't want to give up the h2 pawn. Queen g4 check, king e3, and g5. I don't know, this is like the third or maybe fourth, fifth, I haven't kept count, one where Aronian refuses to capture material with queen takes b4, which should probably lead to a win as well, slowly but surely. But he doesn't see the need for it, he just wants to keep his initiative going, goes g5, turning queen f4 check and g4, bringing new resources into the fight. And Carlsen's in trouble. He tries to secure his king by going king f2, queen f5. Once again, this pawn is being ignored. Instead, Aronian has his eyes set on going g4 and harassing this knight. Rook d8 check, king g7, no more checks, king to g2, g4, knight has to go, knight d2, and queen e6. Overstretching the white defenses, threatening queen e2 check, and threatening queen c6 check. With the king so loose and the pieces so far away from each other, there's just no way for white to hold this position. Could have played b5, but then at the very least queen e2 check picks up the b5 pawn. Therefore Carlsen tries something else. Logical move, knight f1, trying to put your knight closer to your king. I was taught that knights are the best friends of the king, and indeed this knight would block a lot of checks. After, let's say, queen e2 check, king g1, all of a sudden the conversion wouldn't be so easy, but black does have a stronger move. And this turns out to be the last move of the game, the move queen c6 check, because it picks up decisive material. No matter where you go, white loses the rook. King g3, queen c7, well, king f2 or king g1 runs into queen b6, and in every case the rook is lost. So a quick end for Magnus Carlsen, but his position was tough to defend anyway. And a big win for Levon Aronian, who came fresh of a loss, had lost to MVL, the Frenchman, the game before, but comes back with a big point with black against the world champion, announcing that he's ready to do battle even with Magnus Carlsen again. Tough start to the tournament for Magnus Carlsen, losing the game for Norway. Norway went on to lose the match in spite of some very good positions against the eternal overachievers Armenia, who always do great in these team events. They have a strong team, but they tend to do even better than the sum of their parts. Always a force to be reckoned with. Big point for Levon Aronian. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm off to Los Angeles. I'm gonna check out what's going on over there in the United States. Haven't been for a while. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. I don't know when, but I'll just say I'll see you soon. See you next time. Bye-bye.